The will was read on a Thursday afternoon in an attorney's office in Durham, North Carolina, with gray March light coming through the windows and a box of tissues on the table that nobody touched because nobody was crying yet. My parents had died 11 days apart, my father from a sudden cardiac event, and my mother 4 days later from what the doctors called a broken heart, and what I understood to mean that 41 years of marriage had made them a single organism, and the organism could not survive the first loss. I was 31. My sister Vanessa was 34. We sat across from each other at a conference table with the estate attorney, a man named David Portman, between us, and I was holding Vanessa's hand because she was shaking, and because whatever else was true between us, she was my sister, and she had lost both parents in 11 days, and her hand was shaking. David Portman opened the folder. He said the things attorneys say, the legal preambles, the formal attestations, and then he came to the distribution section, and he read it, and the room rearranged itself around what he said. To Vanessa Marie Calloway, my surviving estate, including the house, the investment accounts, the personal property, and all remaining assets with a combined estimated value of $2.4 million. To my younger daughter, Elise Patricia Calloway, the sum of $1, which is the legal minimum required to demonstrate awareness of a surviving heir. My hand, which had been holding Vanessa's, went still. Vanessa made a sound I had never heard her make before. I looked at David Portman, who was looking at the document with the careful expression of a man who has seen difficult estate distributions, and who understands that his job in this moment is to be a neutral surface. I said, "Is there anything else?" He said, "There is a sealed envelope. It was left with this office with instructions to give it to you specifically, to Elise, following the reading." He reached into the folder and produced an envelope. The handwriting on the front was not my parents' handwriting. It was larger, rounder, the handwriting of someone older. I looked at it for a moment. I said, "Who left this?" He said, "Your maternal grandfather, a Mr. Thomas Hayward. He left it with this office 14 years ago, with specific instructions that it be delivered to you, and only to you, at this precise moment." I held the envelope. I looked at my sister. She said, "What is it?" I said, "I don't know yet." I said, "I need to read it alone." I walked out of the conference room with the envelope in my hand, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for 17 minutes, and I read it, and by the time I finished, I understood why my parents had done what they had done, and I understood something else, something that I am going to tell you, that made the $1 make complete sense in a way that the $2.4 million never could have. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely stays with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're watching from. My name is Elise Calloway. I'm 32 years old. I am a pediatric physical therapist at a children's rehabilitation clinic in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which means I spend my professional life working with children whose bodies have not yet learned what they are capable of. Children who have been told, sometimes by their bodies and sometimes by other people, that a certain kind of movement or function is not available to them, and whose job in my clinic is to find out whether that's true. I have been doing this work for 6 years, and it is the best work I have ever imagined doing. I mention it because it is relevant to the letter and to everything that came before the letter, and to the specific thing my grandfather understood about me that my parents, in the way that parents sometimes understand their children backwards or late or not at all, never fully managed to see. This is the story of the dollar, the $2.4 million, the envelope in the parking garage, and what Thomas Hayward wrote to a granddaughter. He barely knew about a family history that changed everything. Let me take you back to Durham, North Carolina, a city that contains multitudes in the specific way of places that were built around one thing, tobacco primarily, and before and around that a very old and very specific racial and economic history, and that are now in the process of becoming something else, something more, something that has not yet fully resolved into a shape you can describe completely. My parents' house was in a neighborhood in North Durham that was one of those neighborhoods. The house they had bought in 1994 when the neighborhood was affordable, and which had, by the time they died, become the kind of neighborhood that real estate agents described as up-and-coming, with the specific enthusiasm of people who understand the financial trajectory and are not particularly worried about who that trajectory displaces. The house was a 4-bedroom craftsman, well-maintained, the kind of house that had been loved carefully for 30 years. The $2.4 million was a combination of its value and the investment accounts my parents had built over 30 years of my father's career as an oral surgeon and my mother's as a real estate attorney. My father, Douglas Calloway, was an oral surgeon in private practice in Durham for 27 years. He was a precise man, the kind of precision that surgery requires carried into daily life, into the way he organized his tools and his time and his expectations. He loved his daughters in the way of precise men, specifically, but not always in the direction the daughter needed to be loved, and with a vocabulary of love that was built around achievement and correctness and the satisfaction of things done well. He was proud of Vanessa, who was a corporate attorney. He was proud of me, who was a physical therapist, in the specific, slightly lesser way that parents with a medical background are proud of a child who chose the adjacent but not equivalent profession. Not dismissive, not unkind, just a register lower than Vanessa's, a temperature cooler, the specific warmth you feel when you are standing 4 feet from the fire rather than beside it. My mother, Patricia, was a real estate attorney for 24 years and then went into estate planning, which was where she spent the last 8 years of her professional life. She understood estate documents with the professional precision of someone who had been drafting them for other families for decades, which means that the $1 in her estate documents was not an accident. My mother knew exactly what $1 meant in an estate document. She had put it there specifically and deliberately, and with the full understanding of its legal and relational significance. She had left me $1, and she had known what $1 meant, and she had done it anyway. I want to tell you that this destroyed me. It didn't. What it did was clarify something I had been half seeing for 31 years. Vanessa was the older child and the more legible one in our household. Legible to my parents in the way that some children are legible, meaning the things they were good at were things my parents had language for and valued in the terms they valued. Vanessa was excellent at school. She argued well. She had the specific combination of verbal and analytical intelligence that produces corporate attorneys, and that my parents, both of whom had built their careers around language and argument, recognized and celebrated and organized around. She was the proof of concept. I was the one who was good at bodies. Not sports exactly. I was not athletic in the way that families celebrate athleticism. I was good at understanding how physical systems worked, at reading the way a person moved, and understanding what the movement said about the body underneath it. I had spent my childhood noticing things that other people didn't notice. The way my grandfather Thomas limped after long walks, the way the neighbor's son held his pencil before his fine motor difficulties were diagnosed, the specific protective posture of a child who is in pain that they cannot articulate. I had wanted to go to physical therapy school since I was 16. I had gone. I had become exactly what I wanted to become, and I was good at it, and my parents had been proud of me in the register of 4 feet from the fire rather than beside it for 6 years. The $1 was not news, in a way. It was the largest version of a thing I had been receiving in smaller denominations my entire life. But then I read the letter. Thomas Hayward was my mother's father. He had died when I was 17 from pancreatic cancer. A fast death, 10 weeks from diagnosis to the end, the kind that doesn't allow for the extended farewell conversations that people imagine when they think about dying. He had been an engineer in the textile industry for 36 years, a quiet man from Reidsville, North Carolina, who had married my grandmother Helen in 1958 and raised 3 children in a small house on Scale Street, and who had come to Durham twice a year for Christmas and summer visits that I remembered mostly for the smell of his pipe tobacco and the specific patience of his attention, which was the kind of attention that went slow and did not miss things. He had called me to his room on the last day I saw him. I was visiting with my parents. 2 weeks before the end, a visit that my parents had presented as a normal visit to avoid alarming him, even though everyone in the house understood it was not a normal visit. He had sent the others out, which in itself was unusual. Thomas Hayward was not a man of private dramatic gestures. He had me sit in the chair beside his bed. He had looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Elise, I need you to tell me something." I said, "Okay." He said, "What do you want to do with your life?" I said, "Physical therapy." He said, "Who knows about your body the way you do?" I said, "What?" He said, "You know how people move. You've always known. Who else in this family knows that about you?" I said, "Nobody." He said, "I know." He said, "I've been watching you for 17 years, and I know you better than you think." He said, "I'm going to leave you something." "Not yet. I'm going to give it to David Portman, and it'll find you when the time is right." He said, "The time will be when you need it most." He said, "Will you trust me about the timing?" I said, "Yes, Grandpa." He said, "Good." He squeezed my hand. He sent me out. 2 weeks later he died, and I cried in my room for 3 days, and then I went back to school, and the conversation drifted into the category of things I had held and not fully understood and had not thought about in 14 years until a man named David Portman produced an envelope with the wrong handwriting on it in a conference room in Durham. Let me tell you what the letter said. I am going to tell you as much of it as belongs to you, and I am going to keep the parts that belong only to me. What I will tell you is the shape of it. Thomas Hayward wrote the letter in 2009 when he was already sick and understood that the 10 weeks was the real timeline. He wrote it in the round, deliberate handwriting of a man who is writing the most important thing he has ever written and wants every word to carry what he means. He wrote it to me, specifically to me, Elise, the 17-year-old he had called to his room, the one who knew about bodies. He wrote it in 4 parts. The first part was about my mother. It told me something I had not known, something that my mother had never told me, something that my father had not known until they had been married for 3 years, and that my grandfather had known, since my mother was 22 and had carried alone since then. My mother had been in a serious accident at 22 before she met my father that had left her with a chronic pain condition she had managed silently for the rest of her life. Not visibly. She had managed it specifically and completely the way my mother managed most things that caused her pain, which was invisibly and with full professional function. What my grandfather told me in the letter was that he had watched her manage it for over 2 decades and that it had changed her in ways she had not fully understood about herself. That the chronic management of invisible pain produced a specific and predictable distortion in how you related to your children, specifically in how you related to the child who saw things others couldn't see, because that child saw you. He wrote, "Your mother loves you completely. She has also been afraid of you for 22 years. You see things she has worked very hard not to be seen. She does not know. That's why she keeps you at a distance. But I know. I've watched it, and I need you to know it was never about your worth." I sat in a parking garage, and I read that sentence 3 times. My mother had been afraid of me, not in the way that parents are afraid of a difficult child, in the way that people are afraid of the person who sees through the careful presentation they have maintained for 20 years. I saw bodies. I saw the way people moved. I had seen, without ever naming it, my mother's careful asymmetry, the way she always arranged herself in chairs the slight protective bend in her posture that she had been managing so long it had become invisible to everyone who saw her every day. I had seen it at 11 without knowing what I was seeing. I had filed it the way I filed everything. I had never said anything because I was 11 and because I did not have language for what I saw. My mother had known I saw it. She had kept me at a distance for 22 years because I saw it. The second part of the letter was about the dollar. Thomas Hayward wrote, "I don't know what your parents will do with their estate. I will be gone by the time this is read. But I know your mother and I know how she thinks about money. And I know that she is afraid of what it would mean to leave you what you deserve, because what you deserve is the acknowledgement that you have always been equal to your sister, and she has not always known how to give you that acknowledgement. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that if the estate is not equal, it will not be because you are worth less. It will be because she never figured out how to see you without being seen herself." He wrote, "The dollar, if it comes to that, is her fear, not her love. Remember that." He had known in 2009 that the dollar might come. The third part of the letter was about me and what he saw in me, and I am not going to tell you this part because it is mine. It is the most important part. It is the part one cried about in the parking garage, and the part one have read 12 times since. It is the part where Thomas Hayward told me what he saw in the 17-year-old at his bedside in 2009, and what he expected to find when the letter reached her, and what he hoped she had done with the years between. I will tell you only that he was right about all of it. The fourth part was instructions. He wrote, "In a safety deposit box at First National Bank of Reedsville, box number 447, there is an envelope in your name. The key is in the lining of the blue travel bag I left with your Aunt Margaret. Go get it. It's yours. No one else knows it's there. I made sure." He said, "Take it when you're ready. But take it." He said, "Elise, you are not a footnote. You were never a footnote. Your grandfather sees you. He always has." I sat in the parking garage for 17 minutes. Then I went back inside, and I told David Portman about the safety deposit box. He said, "I wasn't aware of that." I said, "No," I said, "neither was anyone else." Let me pause here because I want to ask you something, and I need your honest answer. If you had been left $1 in your parents' will, and then discovered a letter explaining the psychology behind it, would that explanation have been enough? Would understanding why have changed the hurt? I have sat with this for a year, and I have a specific answer. Tell me yours in the comments first. I drove to Reedsville on a Saturday. My Aunt Margaret, my mother's sister, who had managed my grandfather's effects when he died, and who was 71 now, and who called me every Christmas with a consistency that had always made me feel specifically seen, met me at her house on Hamilton Street. She found the blue travel bag in the back of her closet. The lining had a small zipper pocket I would not have found without knowing to look. Inside the pocket was a small brass key with a paper tag that said 447 in my grandfather's handwriting. We drove to First National Bank of Reedsville together. The box had been registered in my name since 2009. Thomas Hayward had registered it in my name when I was 17 before he died, in a transaction that required only my legal name and a signature he had obtained on a form that I had signed during that last visit, believing I was signing a card for his attorney. He had made sure. He had been making sure since 2009. The envelope was not large. Inside it was a letter, a second letter, shorter than the first, dated October 2009, and a stock certificate. The stock certificate was for 3,000 shares of a textile industry company that Thomas Hayward had worked for and had invested in since 1978, shares that had been placed in trust in my name and that had, over the 14 years since his death, appreciated to a current value of $247,000. The letter with the certificate said, I started buying these shares in 1978 when you were negative 12 years old. I added to them every year until I got sick. I wanted you to have something that came only from me, directly to you, that nobody else had a claim on, and nobody else could redirect or reduce. It's yours, Elise. It was always going to be yours. I just had to get it to the right moment. $247,000 in shares. Started in 1978. Added to every year. For a grandchild who would not be born for another 12 years. I held the certificate for a long time. My Aunt Margaret was watching me. She said, I didn't know what was in there. He told me to give you the key when the time was right, and he told me when the time was right. She said, I thought about asking. She said, but it was his. It was for you. It wasn't mine to know. I said, thank you for keeping it. She said, of course. She said, Elise. I said, yes. She said, he used to talk about you on the phone. She said, he called me once a month for the last 5 years of his life. He talked about all the grandchildren, but you were the one he talked about most. She said, he said, Margaret, that child sees things. He said it every time. She said, I never knew exactly what he meant. She said, do you know? I said, yes. I said, I think I know. I want to tell you about Vanessa because her part of this story is not the story you might expect. Vanessa called me on the Sunday after the will reading. She had called twice that Thursday, and once Friday, and once Saturday. And I had not answered because I was reading the letter, and then I was driving to the parking garage, and then I was reading it again, and then I was in Reedsville on Saturday, and I needed all of those days to be mine before I shared them. When I called her back on Sunday, she said, what was in the envelope? I said, can I tell you in person? She came to my apartment. She sat at my kitchen table. I told her everything. The letter, the car accident at 22, the chronic pain, the fear, the dollar as her fear, rather than her love, the safety deposit box, the shares. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I didn't know about the accident. I said, neither did I. She said, she never told you. I said, no. She said, she never told me either. She said, Elise. I said, yes. She said, I need to tell you something. She said, I knew the will wasn't equal before it was read. Mom told me. I looked at her. She said, she called me 3 months before they died. She didn't explain it. She just said the estate was going to be distributed unequally, and she wanted me to know in advance. She said, I asked her why. She said, Vanessa, there are things about Elise and me that you don't understand. She said, I pushed her, and she said, I'm going to fix it. I just need time. She said she was going to change the documents. She said she never got the time. She said it with the weight of someone who has been carrying the knowledge that the thing was going to be fixed, and the thing was not fixed, and what came out of the reading was the unfixed version. She said, I've been living with that since Thursday. She said, I'm going to make it right. I said, Vanessa. She said, no, listen. She said, Mom was going to fix it. She didn't get to. I'm going to fix it in her place. She said, I want to give you half. I said, Vanessa. She said, not because I feel guilty. Because it's right. She said, she told me she was going to fix it. That means she knew it was wrong. I'm going to do what she was going to do. I looked at my sister. She was 34, and she had just lost both parents in 11 days, and she was sitting at my kitchen table and offering me half of $2.4 million because our mother had told her she was going to fix it and hadn't gotten the time. I said, I don't need half. She said, what do you need? I said, I need you to be my sister. She said, I've always been your sister. I said, I know. I said, I just need that to be the main thing. She said, it is the main thing. She said, it always was. She said, what do you want me to do with the money? I said, keep most of it. But I want you to know that if you want to give me something, not to fix it, but because you want to, I'll receive it as what it is. She said, what is it? I said, an acknowledgement. She said, yes. She said, that's exactly what it is. She gave me $400,000. Not half, $400,000. She said, Mom was going to fix it and she didn't get to, and I want to fix it in her name. I want to give you something in her name that says you were always equal. She said, is $400,000 enough to say that? I said, it's enough. She said, I want it in writing. I said, what? She said, I want it to be a documented gift. I want the record to show that this came from Vanessa Calloway on behalf of Patricia Calloway, because Patricia Calloway knew it was wrong and intended to correct it. She said, I want there to be a record. I said, Vanessa. She said, what? I said, you're going to be a great sister. She said, I've always been a great sister. I said, I know. I said, I should have said it more. Let me tell you where everyone is now. The $247,000 in shares from Thomas Hayward's safety deposit box is in my investment account. I have not spent it. I have looked at it every month since the bank visit with my Aunt Margaret, and it has done what well-tended shares do over 14 years of growth, and it continues to do what well-tended shares do. Every time I look at it, I think about 1978, 31 years before I existed, and a man who decided that the grandchild he had not yet met was worth planning for specifically and directly, and in a form that nobody could redirect. He started buying shares for me before I was born. The specificity of that love, its precision and its patience and its complete indifference to whether it would ever be acknowledged, is the thing I think about most when I think about Thomas Hayward. The $400,000 from Vanessa was received, documented, and has been applied to the clinic. I went into private practice 6 months after the will reading. The Chapel Hill Children's Rehabilitation Clinic I now run did not exist before that money, and it exists now because of the combination of Thomas Hayward's 1978 shares and Vanessa's acknowledgement gift, and my own savings from 6 years of careful practice. I named the clinic. I named it with the specific attention to what names do. Names are the primary document, the first record of what a thing is and whose it is. The clinic is called Hayward Pediatric Rehabilitation. I told my Aunt Margaret when I chose the name. She cried. She called me back 20 minutes later and said he would have thought that was exactly right. I said, I know. She said, he would have said you used the years well. I said, I tried. She said, he would have been correct. She said, he always was. Vanessa and I have dinner every month. We started the dinners the month after the parking garage. She comes to Chapel Hill, or I go to Durham, and we sit for 2 or 3 hours and talk about everything that we did not talk about enough when we were growing up in the same house and organized around different versions of what our parents were. We are learning each other in the specific way of adults who were siblings first and are now choosing to also be friends. It is the best dinner I have every month. My Aunt Margaret and I talk on the phone every Thursday. She calls at 7 in the evening, which is when Thomas Hayward used to call her, a timing she adopted because she said it felt right to use the same hour. We talk about the clinic, about her garden, about the grandchildren she has, and the ones who are coming. She said last month, I've been thinking about what he saw in you. I said, what did he tell you? He said, Margaret, she's going to build something. I don't know what it is yet, but she's going to build something that matters. I can see it. She said, he called the clinic 2 years before you opened it. I said, he called a lot of things. She said, he called you. I said, yes. I said, He called me from 17 years away. Here is what I want to say before I go. My parents left me $1. My grandfather left me $247,000, and the explanation that made the dollar make sense. Both of these things are true and both of them matter, and neither one cancels the other. The dollar was my mother's fear. Thomas Hayward told me so. She was afraid of the child who saw her, who saw the careful asymmetry, the protective posture, the managed invisible pain that she had been carrying for 30 years inside a professional life that required her to be fully functional and fully visible, and never, ever seen. I saw her. I saw her without knowing what I was seeing, and without saying what I saw. I never made her uncomfortable, but she knew I could. And the knowing had made a specific and unconscious distance between us for 22 years that she had intended, 3 months before she died, to correct. She told Vanessa she was going to fix it. She didn't get the time. I forgive her for the dollar. Not because $247,000 arrived from 1978 to cover it. Not because Vanessa gave me $400,000 in acknowledgement. Because Thomas Hayward gave me the letter. And the letter gave me my mother's fear in plain language. And her fear was so specifically human, the fear of being truly seen by the person who was most capable of seeing you, that I could not receive it as cruelty. It was not cruelty. It was the thing that happens when a person spends 30 years managing an invisible wound and raises a child with the specific gift for seeing what others manage carefully not to see, and the child sees, and the parent cannot find the language for the thing between them, and the parent runs out of time. She was going to fix it. I know she was. She just ran out of time. And Thomas Hayward, who had been watching from 17 years away, and who knew her, and knew me, and knew what the letter was going to need to do, had planned for that too. If there is someone in your family who sees you, who has always seen you, who knows the specific way your body moves and what your careful management of things says about what's underneath, I want you to say this. Let them see you. The seeing is not a threat. The person who notices things is not someone to be managed at a distance. They are the person who, if you let them close enough, will understand you more completely than you have ever been understood. The distance protects the presentation. It costs the relationship. And presentations, no matter how carefully maintained, do not outlast the people who built them. The letter arrived at exactly the right moment. Thomas Hayward knew it would. He called me from 17 years away, and he said, "You are not a footnote." He had been saying it since 1978. The shares have been saying it since then, too. I just had to be old enough to read the statement. My name is Elise Calloway. I am 32 years old. My parents left me $1 in their will. My grandfather left me $247,000 in shares he started buying before I was born, and a letter he wrote when he was dying that explained everything about the dollar that I had not known, and that changed in 17 minutes in a parking garage. Every story I had been telling myself about my own family. The dollar was her fear. The shares were his love. Both of them arrived at the same Thursday in Durham. Only one of them was about my worth. Thank you for staying until the very end. If someone left you less than you deserved, and someone else left you proof that you were always worth more than you were given, drop a comment. Tell me what the proof said. I read every single one. If this story found you in a moment where you are carrying $1 and haven't yet found the letter, share it with the person who is keeping a safety deposit box for you. Tell them you're ready. They've been waiting since 1978. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.